awesome. So yeah, let's get started. So today I'm really excited to be meeting with Will Faerber. And Will, just kind of tell me a little bit about your background, how you first off got started with horses, and then how you started your company.
Well, one of the reasons that I historically know so much about what I'm talking about is my father was a horse trainer before World War II and had sort of horses showing in Madison Square Garden, way back, before World War II and all that. And actually was the trainer for the famous boxer Joe Louis, if you remember Joe Louis, and his training camp was next to my father's stable.
That's really cool.
So one of the things I talk about a lot, what a lot of people don't realize, is that at the end of World War II, I know about this because my father came back from World War II expecting to go back into the horse business and discovered that there was no horse business. Most people do not realize that almost every horse in the Western world was eaten during World War II. I mean, that was part of the big thing with Colonel Podolsky saving the white horses in Vienna. They were going to feed them to the troops, just as they did. People don't realize halfway through World War II, they closed down our cavalry depot. They butchered 10,000 horses there and fed them all to the troops. And that has, so it basically, World War II, basically, with the exception of a very few very wealthy people who were able to keep horses away from that, that's kind of where the horse business went. Before World War II, polo was the #1 spectator sport in America, which very few people realize any longer because that all came to an end at the end of World War II. Polo didn't come back again and really until the last 20 years is when it really made a big resurgence again after all those years. So when I was 5 years old, I was brought up in New Jersey, was born in New Jersey, but my parents moved to Kentucky when I was 5 so that they could buy land again. My father wanted to get back into the horse business again, as now it's like the early 60s. And that's sort of about when the horse business started back, so that goes back. My father, from the time I was like 5, he would go out to the West, like a lot of people did, and they started buying up those herds of wild horses. That's where a lot of famous jumpers came from those herds. If you remember some of the early jumpers, cool. Snowbound, some of these horses that came out of those herds that were kind of these weird, freaky horses. But that's where people were getting horses because, most of the riding horses, once again, were long gone and people no longer were using horses for transportation and pulling wagons and all of that sort of thing. Though when I grew up, at 5 years old, when we moved to Kentucky, like for instance, trash pickup was still a horse-drawn wagon that came down the road, and guys came and got your garbage and this sort of thing. So anyway, so I was very firsthand in experiencing, the resurgence of the horse business and what happened to it after that, talking to my father, for all those years along, that kind of thing. And I started showing horses. I showed the first time when I was 8 years old and was professional by the time I was 18 and 19 years old. At 23 years old, I was the head trainer for Patrick's Well Farm in Unionville, Pennsylvania. I was teaching the whole family fox hunting. I was also training steeplechase hunters and jumpers. So that kind of gives you a little bit about my background. I went from I showed from the beginning when horses first started out in the 60s, you go to a horse show and they had everything. They had some jumper classes and they had Western classes and all these things because, were only a few people in each things at those days. So that's what we did. And I learned from the very early days of, you go to a horse show, you ride in this class, you ride them one way, you ride them in a Western class, you stretch them out. So we always had very flexible horses. We were always very into the idea that the horse had a flexible frame that could change, depending on what you were doing with it and what you needed to get done, if that makes any sense. So It wasn't until I left home and went to college that I ever experienced anybody else's teaching other than my father. So I had never experienced, if you will, bad riding, until then, and I was the captain of the show jumping team where I went to college and actually walked away from that. It was the first time I experienced trainers, yelling at students to rip the horse's teeth out and this kind of stuff and beat them over fences and this kind of, I had never experienced any of that kind of training in my life until then. And the big moment for me came the day that I literally got off the horse as the woman was screaming at me to rip its mouth out and just handed the reins to her and said, I had never seen the woman actually even on a horse, much less jump one. And handed her the reins and said, let's see you do it. Needless to say, she didn't, and I left and went on my way, seeking more information, and basically for the next 20 years traveled the world looking at every trainer I could and experiencing as much as I could. Places like the Spanish Riding School, Nuno Oliveira in Portugal, I went to many years in a row. So tried to get an education. I basically came back to understanding that what my father had taught me was the way to do it to begin with, but it was kind of interesting in watching, what became, how we ended up where we ended up now, which is a big point that a lot of people don't realize, is that, we never had this big presence we had this very short period of time after World War II where we brought the greatest trainers over from Europe, Bert Denemeth in jumping, we had Jack Legoff, and once again, our team has never done well since we lost Jack Legoff. We had the greatest event team in the world when Jack Legoff, who was the greatest coach, was our coach. But what happened right away was what we now see has happened with the horse business, is that, we used to have a team, and if you got on the team could take you off of your own horse and put somebody else on your horse back when we had a team, and you had to sign papers to that effect when you went on the jumping team. And unfortunately, those days are all gone, as you know. It doesn't work like that anymore. Now it's individual trainers students with their own trainers. There is no more, they do lip service, they have somebody who they call the coach or something, but really they all have their own individual things. They're all doing their own things. There is no national system. There never has been. Dressage since day one in this country has been a mishmash of ideas. There's never been anyone guiding it who really, quite frankly, knew what they were doing. Historically, I tell some of these stories because I try to open people's eyes about what happened and how did we end up where we ended up, and a lot of that had to do with, the lack of instruction, the lack of videotape, things like that, to what we have now, where we can really see people. And these people that are trying to say, oh, well, that's, when we see these horses being abused at horse shows, and for years people have been using this excuse, oh, that's only a few moments of time, well, nonsense. If you're doing it once, you're going to do it again, and unfortunately that's the problem, and so we saw this situation in the horse shows thing where, there never were any great, people are going to argue with me when I say this, but in my opinion, there never were any great American dressage riders. Everybody was always split into all these different groups, everybody having their own idea about what it was. Historically speaking, one of the most interesting facts, which a lot of people don't realize, is that the first really dressage trainer in America was Alois Podajski, was brought in. Now, you know that name, Alois Podajski, right? Spanish rider, blah, blah, blah. Most people don't know about Alois Podajski, that he never was a trainer. He was a government administrator who got put in charge of the Spanish riding school. He was never a trainer at the Spanish riding school, ever.
That's interesting.
And because he was in this position, he was the guy who went and helped save the white horses with General Patton. But I don't know if you know about this, but after that, Disney made a movie about him, and after the fact, Elizabeth Steinkraus brought him over here to be America's first dressage trainer, not realizing he never was a dressage trainer. He'd never been a dressage trainer. He was just a government administrator who got put in charge of the Spanish riding school and propped up, even in the movies. If you go and watch the movie that he's in that Disney did, now we're all hip to this stuff, so we can clearly see it. But you will see that he walks out to do a levade with a horse. The film is obviously cut, and now a man who's a foot taller than him does the levade. The film is obviously cut again, and now here's this little short guy standing there with the horse turning around like, blah, blah, I did this. So just to show how media, how we were fooled by media even back then, and what led to, once again, this is when we were first trying to get dressage off the ground in America. So my point is, it was led by somebody who was a sham to begin with. Now, it was interesting, when I went to the Spanish riding school in about 1976, I went to ride the Spanish riding school. And when you went in the Spanish riding school, there's nothing, because all we hear about in America was Alois Podajski, and of course his books, paintings. Well, sitting down with the master, with the guy who was now the runner of the Spanish riding school back in those days, told me the whole story, that just what I'm telling you, that he was never a trainer there. He rode a horse. He did ride in one Olympic Games on a horse they took away from Rohovansky. Franz Rohovansky trained the horse. They took it away from him, put this other guy on it so that he could be in the Olympics because he was the big star, right? And that's what made his career. So that's kind of what we saw. The point is I'm making here is that that was the beginning of dressage in America, and it was the very poor beginning because it was with somebody who really didn't know what they were doing to begin with. And if you even read his books, you can read between the lines. He says in his books, I came to America and I never lunged a horse. He'd never actually even lunged a horse, and he says that in his book. So anyway, I just say all this so people will realize the historical reality of how we got to where we got to now. There are two other major factors that ended up in how we ended up where we end up today, and they both happened about 1985. We have two things that happened. First, this woman named Debbie Dolan, I remember that name. Her father owned this, I think, Dolan Horse Insurance. Okay. She sued the AHSA because she had the most show points, but did not get on the dressage on the jumping team, and she won. The Supreme Court sided with her. So that's what turned everything around. So now the only way anybody can get on our Olympic teams is by having the most show points. That's the only thing that can put you there now. So that means that only those people who can afford to spend $1 million sending their horse all over the world to show in shows can get the points necessary to get in there. At the same time, we had for the first time, the AHSA hired for the first time a professional CEO to run the American Horse Show Association, who was, up until then, we'd always had a horseman was always in charge. It was usually some wealthy, amateur owner or something, but, more of a position of a respect than anything else, you know what I mean? So that began the AHSA's, the American Horse Show Association's thing of just, it was all then about numbers of people. How many people can we bring into the sport? Suddenly we saw scores, especially in dressage, going from, it used to be the winners of Grand Prix would be getting a 72%, now all of a sudden the scores are jumping into the 80s and 90s. And I mean, what are they going to do when they get to 100? I don't know, but they'll have to add extra points. So anyway, so that's one of the biggest things I talk about is getting people real historical perspective on how we got to where we got to now, which is especially in dressage. I mean, jumping is one thing because you either get over the fences or you don't. People do it in better or less good ways at the kind of thing like that. But dressage just turned into something that no one really understands anymore. There's no, in other words, the worst horse can go in now and win, and we see what's happening here. So getting perspective on that, I think, is very important for people to understand where we end up going, with horses and with horse showing, what's its place in the future. And to me, if we are not, if that future doesn't also include protecting the horses while they're doing all this, and I remind people that the only reason, for instance, the American Horse Show Association was set up, it was set up to protect the horses at horse shows. It wasn't set up to give ribbons. It was set up to protect the animals, to set up guidelines to protect the animals being used for these sports. And of course, now that's all gone out the window. We have legalized drugging if you can afford it. So in other words, because of this now, it's legal you can't give a horse 2 tabs of bute at a horse show, but you can inject every bone in its body if you can afford to have it done. Yeah. And that's how they're getting through the horse shows on these lame horses, and they're now calling that legal. The veterinarians are calling it therapy. Well, there's nothing therapy about it. I mean, you eject a horse's joints more than 3 times and the joint is gone, and so is the horse, which is what's led to now, now you are a body worker yourself. Is that what you do with horses?
I am, yeah. So I started off doing veterinary stuff, and then I went to chiropractic school. So I developed some different body work techniques for animals. Right. So yeah, primarily work with horses, but also small animals too. But yeah.
Right. And humans.
Well, I'm licensed for people, but I don't really work on them. It's been a long time since I've actually worked on people. I like the animals better.
That's great. Well, I always found, for years, our chiropractor always worked on us when we come.
I used to do that. Yeah, I used to work on horses and riders together, but I mostly teach now. So I have students all over the world. But yeah, so primarily doing the teaching. But yeah, definitely what you're saying. It's so interesting. I started riding in the 80s. I was 5 when I started. I was born in 1982. But things have changed a lot, and hearing your perspective starting back when you did, it's really interesting how it started off. But I mean, even I was at a WEC at the World Equestrian Center recently, and my room was next to where they warm up the horses, and they had a Western pleasure show happening. And when I was a kid, I did a little bit of Western pleasure. Like I competed a bit in that. Watching those poor horses, I couldn't even watch them out the window. It was so freaking sad what they make those horses do. And they're yanking on their faces and the horses look miserable. And I'm just like, it's rough.
It's hard to understand, is it that I wonder myself, is it that people have gotten so far away from, when I grew up, horses were my friends, as were my dog. I grew up around hounds and horses and we were with them all day long. It wasn't this kind of thing where they were just another thing stuck in a stall to pull out and do another one and pull out another one out of a stall and do it the way it kind of turned into, and we did all kinds of different things. We didn't just show our horses, and I've fox hunted since I was a kid. So, that was also a big part of what we did. That's how I started out, doing Western and hunters jumpers, and then I started doing jumpers and then more 3-day eventing as I got more into fox hunting. And of course, that's what led me, like many people. I think I was always doing dressage. The first thing my father taught me as a child was to stretch horses. And the first thing he would say, because we rode our horses in and out and all kinds of, if you're going cross country, your horse has got to look where it's going. If its head is in the air, it's not looking at the ground it's about to step into,
Yeah,
and I can tell you how many times in the hunt field, you see the person that's got the horse head straight in the air, and they're the ones that goes into the fence and ends up in the barbed wire and ends up in the hole or where, because the horses aren't seeing where they're going. So yeah. I grew up with that kind of idea that horses the frame was a flexible thing. We didn't just keep them locked in one position, for hours and hours and hours. As we did different things with them, we helped different frames. We let them be in different, of course, from the beginning, I was always taught that you never hold a horse into a frame. It's not anything you do with your hands. It's something that, as the horse develops physically, it can simply stay in the correct frame for as long until it's exhausted. And understanding those kind of things. So yes, it's changed so much. So I live here in California now. My wife and I have two places. We have a place in Oregon. We don't actually have horses in California anymore because we became just very frustrated with how landlocked it all is. Very few places have anywhere here that you can go on back of horse. You ride in the ring and you ride around the little property that you're on, and and you stick them back in the stall. And that for me just became, I just couldn't enjoy it like that anymore.
Yeah.
I wanted to get back. So we have a lovely place in Oregon where we have our horses now.
Oh, nice.
In and out, and and they have a beautiful life rather than in California. So it's interesting to see where it goes when we look at the prices. How expensive. I don't know. It's like, I guess you can still. It's not too bad where you are there, but in California, it's $35 for a bale of hay. So
it's getting pretty high in Florida too. The problem is we don't really grow any hay here in Florida, so we have to import it all in. And prices, even just the past few years, my hay prices have like doubled or tripled.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
And I think we're going to see, like, I first moved to San Diego in 1976. And in 1976, San Diego had more horses per capita than any other place in the United States.
Oh, wow.
And everybody had, in those days you could ride on the beach. Everybody had houses down by the beach, had horses in their backyard. You could ride down. That's all now gone. They don't allow horses to get anywhere near the beaches anymore.
Yeah, we still have some we can ride on here in Florida, so it's seasonal. So our beaches actually open up soon, and then they close in March. But it is nice riding on the beach.
Yeah, that was always the best. I was in Malibu for many years, and to be able to go out on those private beaches there and gallop in that sand, I missed it a great deal.
Yeah.
So it's a very changing, and things like what you do. I very much encourage people to have body workers if they can find good ones. And you probably know what we went through in like the mid 80s when we had these people. All of a sudden, chiropractors were coming out of the woodworks. None of them had licensed. We had a guy, I don't know if you remember this, but we had a guy here who actually broke some horses' necks while he was trying to chiropract them. I was at one of those barns when that happened one day. So, like anything else, I say to people all the time, whenever you see, it's like what I see now, and like with the horse training, everybody's looking for some other way. Now, in my opinion, the way they ought to be looking is the old way, the way we used to train horses, but they're looking for some new angled thing. And so we see lots of people coming out of the woodworks who have the right idea in that they no longer want to, hang on to their horses' mouths, like so many people are doing these
Yeah.
At the same time, they're replacing it with something like, okay, now we're not having bridles. We're just going to ride with neck reps, or we're going to do this and that. But it doesn't matter if you still don't understand how a horse physically should move correctly over its back. I don't care if you ride them in a neck rope or whatever, or a halter. As you know, if you're riding the horse hollow, the effect is the same. Maybe it's a little slower if you're not also cramming their neck over to their chest at the same time. But the effect of riding a horse hollow or tense and hollow or tense and round, what they tried to do with rollering, they had this idea to get horses over their back, but in so much tension that it destroyed anything good that they were trying to achieve. Because a horse that's holding itself at that level of tension is going to destroy its joints, just like a horse that's completely hollow, right?
Yeah.
So getting people aware of all this and how we go forward, in the future for keeping horses, for instance, and I've seen some interesting things that I've seen which might be an answer, in the future, which is some of these what do they call them? You probably know better than I. Where they set up these tracks where horses live in these areas that are kind of like a maze that the horse has to live through.
I actually saw one recently. I was in the Netherlands teaching, and they had one set up. It's called Pasture Paradise.
Yeah,
they call it.
It's a great idea. So you can take a couple of acres, because the problem, and this is one of the things I point out to people all the time. I grew up on a farm. My father would come out to the West. He'd buy 50 horses at a time. They'd come onto our farm, which was thousands of acres. And the horses lived in herds. We kept up horses that we kept. I could have any of them that I wanted. And we kept up the ones that we rode and showed, but the rest of them were just out in pastures, sometimes for years. People would come in and we'd take them out in Jeeps and they'd look, oh, we don't want to see that one. And we'd run them all up the barn and they'd pick out the ones and I'd have to get on them and ride them. That was an interesting education at a very young age. But you know what I mean? But the horses, when they came in, they looked good. They didn't look like swayback nags because they were living on thousands of acres. They were moving in a herd over thousands of acres of land all the time. So many people now, we saw a lot of in the 80s, we saw a lot of people trying to raise horses in California. Happily, most of that has gone away. So you see people buying a mare and trying to raise a baby in a 24 by 24 pipe corral. Yeah. And wondering why when you're 3 years old, they try to work the horse and its joints just fall apart because, it's like a kid who's never done anything but play video games their whole life, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, things that can help us, if you don't, because horses need, as I said, I grew up on horse farms in Kentucky where horses were, a small pasture would be 50 acres, it wouldn't be like 2 acres that they would come out on, so, and always undulating hills. So they're moving up and down hills and this thing. And, so how we move forward in the future, I think is very important of how we change how we keep horses. This whole idea which started in the kind of the late 70s or 80s, and now all of a sudden 80% of horses are living 23 hours a day in 12 by 12 box stalls, if they're even that big sometimes,
Yeah, and essentially the only exercise they get is when they're being ridden or worked, and it's like they need to move on their own.
Exactly, they need to move on their own. And of course, so many people working in that way, which is kind of what led me to a bit of the way I go about teaching. If you don't, my organization is called Art to Ride, and I teach people from the very beginning how to work horses from the ground, bring them along and develop them, and understand that it's, if you get on a horse before it's strong enough to lift its back, it's not going to. And there's no amount of anything that you do. As I said, the roll curve was an attempt to try to force a horse's back up. But yes, you can do that, but it creates so much tension in the body of the horse that you actually create more damage than if you just rode the horse hollow, if that makes any sense. So that kind of idea that we have to get horses strong enough. I try to show people, when they're strong enough to do, you're fighting with your horse because you're asking it to do something it physically can't do. But so many people today have been told this idea, you just whip them up. The horse just doesn't want to do it. It's just the horse being stubborn. They can do that. Horse big, strong horses, and I'm sure as a body worker, you've gone out and it became the 80s and 90s were the ages of all of a sudden it was okay to be overweight and ride horses. Now, I think that is starting to go away, but the 80s and 90s especially, all of a sudden we had, all these 350-pound people trying to ride horses. And most of them went out and bought horses like Friesians. And as a body worker, I'm sure you've seen this. Almost every Friesian you see today is completely sway back. You see them when they put the saddle on, because those horses have the weakest backs of any breed. I've worked with almost any breed you can think of over the years. And of them all, I think Friesians have the weakest backs of any horses because they're so big and they're so heavy. If they don't get that time, in other words, if they don't learn to lift their back before someone gets on them, they never will. They'll just be hollow. And just because they're big doesn't mean they're big enough to carry a 350-pound person. Those people.
I think that's a misconception people have sometimes.
Yep. I do see a change in that. I don't see the 90s was the worst in that era of, people just thinking they could be, obesely overweight and still ride horses. I see less of that.
One thing I see a lot too, I have Western performance horses and I don't compete with them anymore, but they're trained for that. But a lot of times, like even with like the reiners and the cutters, you see these big guys and, a lot of these horses are smaller. They're like 14.3. They're little horses and they have, guys that are pretty big and they also have a big saddle that the saddle's too big for the horse's back. And you tend to see that a lot too.
Yeah. Well, in most cases, those saddles are, they're, in many cases, it's kind of good that they're the way they are because they're kind of like a pack saddle. In other words, it at least those big saddles do spread the weight over a big area if at least they fit halfway decently. But, a heavy person is better off being on a 15 quarter horse that's short back than being on some 17-hand Friesian that's a mile long, thinking be able to carry you. So,
yeah, definitely. So I watched some of your videos. So tell me, if somebody reaches out to you, do you basically have them film themselves lunging and riding their horse and you kind of give them like feedback through that, or how does it typically work?
Are you talking about in person or on my online when I work with people?
I saw some of your YouTube stuff. So are those clients of yours that you're filming?
Yeah, so I give clinics all over the world, and I have become very good at pulling out my I always have the iPhone has been a huge thing that you can pull it out and I can make little short clips and videos and film, because I try to do that when I do lessons. At the point at which the horse is really working over its back correctly, I want to take a picture or a little video so the person can see that when I go away, this is what what you're trying to accomplish. So what I start off by teaching people work in hand, which I think for beginning riders or any rider, it's because when you are working in hand from the ground, you can't just grab hold of a horse's mouth and try to pull its head down like you can when you're on the back of a horse, So it really teaches people the right feel that they need so they learn to stretch a horse into the contact before they ever get up there. Now, I don't know if you remember this, but it was about 1991 or so when they first put the stretches in dressage tests. And I thought, well, finally, people are going to have to learn how to ride because the stretch is what proves the correctness. If you can't do the stretch, you're not doing dressage. Your score should be practically zero because more than likely it should have been. And I was so happy when I saw that and hopeful, but the trainers just ignored it. The trainer says, when you get to that part, just let go of the reins a little bit. And then pretty soon the judges started ignoring it as well, and then the scores went out the windows. And, once again, I was hopeful, but it turned out to be a non-starter and the people just ignore it. They're still ignoring it and still telling people that, why is the stretch there? They tell, how many trainers I've heard tell people that stretching horses is terrible for them and you should never stretch them and these kind of things. It's like, okay, well, will you tell yourself that? Tell a human athlete you should never stretch, you should never warm up, you should just go right to the hardest thing you can do? Does that make any sense to anybody who's ever been an athlete in any kind of way? Why would you think your horse can do this? Oh, well, the horses are big, strong, they can just do it. It's kind of people's mentality about it. Yeah. So that's why the work in hand is very important to get people. And once again, to teach people, to teach the horse to lift the back before they get on. So the point that I do all the groundwork is so people can really recognize And most horses, especially these days, that have been, living in some little corral or been being ridden upside down, it takes a while to get them strong enough to get on. So to understand that if the horse can't lift its back, when you get on it, it's not going to be able to lift its back. So why get on it? So, and if you go back and look at, the Spanish, if you read the Spanish Riding School's book, which was really Padaisky, the book that, and once again, this is what the Spanish Riding School director told me, that's why they also didn't have anything to do with him there. He stole their manual. So that book that Padaisky published was the Spanish Riding School manual. He translated it into English and published it as his own book. So you can imagine how angry they were about that. So that's why if you ever visit the Spanish Riding School, you will see that there is no mention of Alois Padaisky anywhere there, or there's no pictures of him on the walls or anything else, So anyway, if you go back and read that book, they talk about, the Spanish Riding School lunged horses for 2 years before they ever rode them. They would only walk and trot a horse for a full year before they'd ever expect it to canter, and that's once they were trying, that was they were, putting down that idea of this, if you train a horse like this, it can last to be 35 years old. Which is true.
And I think in the U.S. as well, we start them too early. Like so many people are starting them as 2-year-olds under saddle, and it just puts too much strain on them.
And who we have to blame for that is the American Horse Show Association and the breeders that got into the American Horse Show Association and pushed for all these 2- and 3-year-olds for futurities. Any horse that goes in a 2-year-old futurity is probably wrecked by the time it's 5 or 6. They're already injecting the joints and they're gone. So it's just the worst possible thing you could do with a young horse. So
I don't understand why we're still doing it. I feel like they should have changed that by now. There's so much research and science out there about how hard it is on their joints and bodies.
Unfortunately, the people who should be listening to you and I and should be reading these articles are not. I cannot tell you how many people that have come to me that said, well, my last trainers told me never read books because you'll be confused if you read the book. Because there are no books that tell you to grab a hold of a horse's face and pull it into its chest and kick the shit out of it, and beat it until it starts hopping up and down. There are no books that say that. So, of course, these people are all telling their students not to read because, or they read these ridiculous books there's so many books today. Most people don't realize that almost none of the people riding Grand Prix today train the horses that they ride. They buy made horses. None of the riders in America, they're all buying made horses that they're riding until the wheels fall off, and then they buy them another one. So they're getting advice from people who never were good trainers, because most American trainers have never actually trained a horse to those levels. The top guys are mostly getting them bought for them, and they ride them until the wheels fall off. End of story. So we're all getting a lot of. The point was, there are people who should be listening to you and I, should be reading the articles about this, should be reading Padaisky's book that he stole from the Spanish Riding School, but they should be reading those things, but they're not. And if they did, they would be questioning it, But the trainers all tell them, once again, the proof is in the ribbons. As long as they've got a wall full of ribbons, they can claim I'm right because I'm winning these ribbons, And where the horse shows have been such a disservice to horses themselves, because we have forgotten who is really important in all of this. It was all about the horses to begin with. And if my kingdom for a horse, if you kill your horse, but that's the problem. I mean, it's becoming so many people, it's not so much the person. I mean, growing up, I never knew anybody that had 6 or 8 show horses. They had one, when I grew up in dressage, in dressage, nobody had trainers. We all trained our own horses. And you took pride in the fact that you trained the horse. I did this, not some trainer. It wasn't until the 80s and 90s that all of a sudden we saw dressage turning into the same thing as hunter jumpers, where every student is. And I take the blame. I did that myself for a while till I worked with enough billionaires' children that I finally handed one the reins and said goodbye. When they asked me to drug a horse at a horse show, no, I'm doing that. And I was told by this billionaire woman that, well, the other kids' trainers, they give them something. They just give them something. I said, well, I'm not going to give them anything. I already gave the horse. Had already, in the case, how people are. This horse in particular had already won the grand championship for the day. It didn't need to do anything else. But the girl wanted to go in one more class. Well, the horse was finished. It was already suddenly turning into a basket case over it. Said, look, the horse is done. You won the championship. Oh, you should drug him so she can go in one more class. So unfortunately, that's the mentality of the people.
Yeah.
It's not like I don't know what your history was like, but I grew up within a family, and most of the people I knew were also like in Unionville. My next door neighbor was the guy who started Equus magazine. I was out with those people. I mean, the veterinarians that I rode, Matthew McKay Smith was his name. In Kentucky, my veterinarian was John O'Brien. I mean, these guys were the guys that they write books about. You know what I mean?
That's pretty cool.
Not like that anymore. And now I get the feeling from so many to me, any veterinarians who is willing to inject every joint in a horse's body should have their license taken away from them, in my opinion, if they're willing to do that, because they know very well what's going to happen to that horse. I mean, if you talk to any human doctor, with human doctors, if you talk to them, they're not allowed to do any more than three injections to a joint, because after the third one, the joint is starting to totally deteriorate and you're finished. What they're doing to all these horses. That's why, I mean, even as a body worker, how many horses have you run into that are literally just crippled in every joint in their body?
Oh, so many of them, especially, I mean, I have a horse that I bought him after, he did all of his reining training, but hocks fuse, but they're like, oh, we want the hocks fuse. It's easier for them to stop them. It's like,
then they can just, what do you deal with that mentality, right?
I know. Yeah, it's just crazy. But like what you were saying too, when I was a kid, I mean, my horse was my best friend and I competed with him, but my main goal was to have a good time with my horse. And if my horse wasn't doing well or wasn't happy with the situation we were in, that's all that, like, I would get him out of it. I mean, it wasn't about winning. It wasn't about anything. It was just about enjoying my time with my horse and making sure my horse was happy. So I find it hard. I mean, you see all these kids nowadays showing, and it's just about winning. It's about, they just want to win. And I don't know. For me as a kid, it was different. Like my horse was my best friend. I would have done anything for that horse.
Yep. I grew up exactly the same way. And yes, I did go to horse shows and show my horses, but that was something else that we did. We also went fox hunting. We did all kinds of things. But we rode every day. We rode out every day. Mm-hmm. And we're doing something, riding fence lines or something that you had to do in those days, and so it wasn't just this one focused thing that has no other. And that's the sad thing. And you've seen it. These kids come out of the ring on their $100,000 horse that doesn't win, and they're ready to throw the reins down and let's get another one, because they've been. And once again, the trainers love that mentality, because that's where they make money. They don't make money off lessons. They make money when they sell you the next expensive horse. Yeah. That's when they make their house payment. They're not making their house payment off of the lessons. Of course. So why would they care? They want a person to turn over the horse. And people tell me, oh, my trainer told me I'll be turning over the horse every 2 years. I'll be getting a different one every 2 years. Really? What a bizarre idea. It takes 2 years to even begin correct training on them, to establish correct. It takes about a 2 years level of time to establish a top line on a horse. So you're just getting started, rather than you're throwing them away to get another one because that one didn't win. So I don't know what the future holds. Yeah. Hopefully and I don't hold out much hope for it, because I keep seeing the same for the last 35 years. I've been watching, I see lip service, like the whole thing of roll crane horses, all of a sudden it's bad to roll crane horses, but if we call it something else, it's perfectly fine. They just change the name. Oh, that's just low, deep, and round or something. They make some other name out of it, instead of changing. But the biggest problem is, and once again, getting back to where this is all going for me, the reason I did what I did, you've been to my website, I've done over 700 educational videos. I have tried to show people this is your alternative. This is how horses used to be trained, when they were trained correctly and developed in a way that you could use them for 25 years. And so I'm simply trying to be a voice of another way of doing it. And once again, all those videos are free for people to watch. I mean, obviously I do make money off my clanks and these sort of things, but I'm much more interested in where we get to, for everybody and the horses than I am that, I make a lot of money off of this. I just want this information not to go away, and I know there's, for instance, most people today have never even heard of the trainer who actually is you could probably call the father of really what is the modern system, which was Egon von Neindorf, his book Dressage Formula. I don't know if you've ever read it. It was actually written by one of his students by the name of Eric Herbermann. And he basically did a very good job of writing down Egon von Neidorff's system. At the end of World War II, when dressage started back again, the two biggest stars in the world were Nuno Oliveira in Portugal and Egon von Neidorff in Germany. Both of them were winning championships and everything. And they both walked away from showing, and they were both doing similar things. Nuno was doing it on Andalusian horses or Lusitano horses. So a slight difference there. But he was, in his early books, he was always stretching horses and showed horses stretching and developing correctly. And even in older age, when you saw him, I went to Portugal 5 years in a row and spent a month there 5 years in a row working with Nuno, until I once again sort of realized what was really happening. And this is once again those ideas of how people get confused. So if you look up Nuno Oliveira now, you will see that there are suddenly lots and lots of people who claim to be Nuno Oliveira's, premier students, and some of them claim to be his cousins and this and that. Well, I was around Nuno for 5 years, really the last 10 years of his life. I never heard about any of these cousins, or whatever. None of them ever came and went while I was there. Mm-hmm. Never heard about any of them existence. And if you look at them now, I don't know how much you know about Nuno, but if you look at most of the pictures we see of him and the stuff from now, and even the later books that he did, he always has this big fat belly out ahead of him. His head is looking down at the back of the horse's heads like this. He could not ride any longer. People don't realize that he retired in about 1965 or 7 and completely stopped riding for a while, but was totally broke. And he only went back into being a trainer because he was broke. He had a wife in a very expensive mental institution. He could not ride anymore. And this whole thing of him riding with his head down and the big fat gut out in front of him. Nowadays, if you go on YouTube, there are 2 or 3 videos from his heyday. As I tell you, when you see the pictures of Nuno when he could sit straight in the saddle, when his head was still on top of his shoulders before it came to this position, and you see that the horses were very, very different. And after he really couldn't ride anymore and adapted this weird thing, that now if you look at all these people who've copied Nuno Oliveira, they're all sitting like he did at the end of the...
I was actually going to say, I was at WEC recently, and I saw somebody riding just like that. He was young. He was like a teenage boy, but he was a little overweight, and I was like, why is he sitting like that?
That's why, because they all have seen these and Nuno, unfortunately, he was... I love the man, don't get me wrong, because he showed me a lot of things, but I also stopped going there because I realized I watched him train the last horses that he trained. They never got anywhere. All he was doing was putting on a show for people. He hardly ever got out of a walk because his back hurt so bad. He really couldn't ride anymore and had really adapted something that was totally different than what he was doing. It was interesting. His son, Joao, like when I was there, he and his son would ride at the same time. They'd each bring in 2 horses and they'd lunge them and then get on them and ride them. And his son, Joao, who sadly died here in California it's been about 15 years now, but it was like watching 2 different things, because his son rode like he had ridden and sat very straight, and like he would be literally looping Nuno as they went around this little tiny arena. He would be passing him left and right, and Nuno would still be in this weird slow motion thing. But that's what I realized he was doing. But it was interesting because he was always talking about, I have all these movies and things. One day I'll show people this thing. And I'm realizing that he never did show. I mean, I was there for 5 years. I asked him 100 times to show those movies. Never did. It's only now we see some of these popping up. Once again, look at those early videos when he was really competing. Look at the difference in the horses. Look at how he was sitting straight. Totally different thing. But because of, once again, people not realizing, and all these people, promoting him after his death and adapting this way that he rode at the end of his life when he could not ride anymore. So when you see that, that's exactly what it is. And it's really sad to me because now we have these people who are mostly completely charlatans coming out saying that they're his premier students and writing books about. There's this one guy that I know Nuno hated with a passion and kicked out of his barn, and he writes this big book, Riding with Nuno Oliveira, like he was, his best friend. Nuno hated this guy, and he would literally roll in his grave if he saw this book, today, that this guy now promoting himself as his premier student, which he never was, kind of thing. So anyway, getting our heads around what we can see out there in media. And once again, so many of the good books. Like if I told people, if you need a good book, if you had one book, Dressage Formula by Eric Herbermann, which is the system of Egon von Neindorf at the height of his career, that's the book you should read. That's the book that Klimke was reading. That's the book that people who, the best riders of the 20th century are riding like that. And that was really, and once again, it was then that they started already moving away and into this more hollow type of dressage, and something that, now dressage looks like saddlebred. It looks like a Tennessee Walker to me. It has I would be giving these people 0 on their, if it were me. A hollow-backed horse that's nervous isn't doing, if it's hollow, it can't be collected. So how can you give a hollow horse, a 9 or 10 on some collected movements when it's impossible, right? That as a body worker, right? Can the horse be hollow and be collected? Well, no. It can be shortened. You can pull its neck in and you can shorten its stride, which is what most people today, they think they're collecting. Well, all they're doing is shortening the stride. And if they actually had to open that horse up and gallop, they'd be on their heads, because a horse that's ridden like that, as soon as you open them up, they fall apart. And like what we see in the dressage ring today, the extensions that we see where these horses are throwing their front legs, the hind legs are falling out behind them and the front legs are being thrown out, which as a body worker, you would know, and any real horseman would know, that every time you see those extreme extensions, you know that the joints in that leg are being destroyed. With every time they throw that out and lock it out like that, boom. That's another nail in the horse's coffin later on, if you want to look at that.
It's pretty sad. So if people want to watch your videos and see what you do and learn more about this so they can get their horses, moving correctly, where do they go? What's your website?
Art2Ride, ART2ride.com, and there's an Art2Ride channel on YouTube. And you can, if you go to any of my videos, it'll take you to the Art2Ride. I think on YouTube, the channel is spelled ARTTORIDE, because there was something about when we first did it, you couldn't put the letter in there, the number in there for some reason or other. But anyway, if you go to our website, that will lead you to all those things, and as well as other good information.
And you have some online courses as well, right? If somebody wants to actually take a course.
Yes. So there are, what I did was I did a 3-part series where I took a young horse and filmed it every day for bringing it up into working gaits and took it that far. So that's a 3-part. That is the only one of my videos that actually costs money to buy. And it's like $50 a section for each 3-hour section of it to ride. But all the rest, all that same information is in all the free ones. It's just in a more condensed and on the same horse. And you can literally see the same horse day after day after day and how it develops into working gaits. Yeah. Okay.
And if somebody wants personalized feedback from you, can they take like a remote lesson where they film it?
Yes, and that is, I'm so excited about this because this started a couple of years ago, and I actually thank the pandemic for this, because the problem with correct training, with getting horses working, is people having the patience to stick with what they're doing until it gets somewhere, and so what I found in traveling around the world giving clinics is that I'd get people there, and a percentage of them would stay there, but as soon as they went home and all their social friends around them were telling them, why are you stretching that? Why are you doing that? That's a waste of time. That's a waste of time, So they weren't staying on track. Some would, but this online thing really enables me to work with anybody anywhere in the world, and I'm really having wonderful results this way. So anyway, it's great. So you can talk to me online. I have phone consultations. Sometimes people send me videos to watch, or they're buying horses and they want me to talk, take a look at it some night. So as well as you can send me a video and I do a voiceover critique. But that's what I did before. But this way of working these new cameras, there's Pivos and Pixios. The Pivo one only costs like $200 now, and that's all you need is an iPhone and one of those, and ready to go to work. And it works. Now that most people have 5G everywhere, I'm really excited about it because it really works well and enables me to keep people on track. And as I said, because that's the hardest when people are training by themselves to know, well, when am I ready to take the next step? When do I need to ask for that little bit more? Because real training is very subtle. It's not this, yank 'em, crank 'em, spank 'em thing that people have gotten used to seeing. It's looking at these minute changes, watching the back, watching the top line develop, watching the changes in the horse's body, and being able to look at those and recognize them on a daily basis, to see that you're on track. And that's what's really important. So I've tried.
It's so hard to find good trainers and riding instructors anymore. So that's great that you can offer this to people all over so they can, get feedback, because trying to find somebody locally, it's just really difficult.
It's almost impossible. And for instance, I'm in San Diego. I live there's, 5 or 6 so-called Grand Prix dressage riders around me, all of which who just are guys who have horses bought for them. One of them was at the last Olympic Games, and it was very sad because he came in next to last. It was, they paid $5 million for this horse, and and he's standing there and he's trying to do damage control. So he's come out to try to take the blame for why he did so badly, and he's standing there with this horse that's supposed to be a Grand Prix horse, and this horse looks like it's ready like something out of a killer pen. It has no top line whatsoever. Its withers is sticking up like some 20-year-old thoroughbred with a hollow back, and it was kind of interesting. I just wondered if anybody other than me picked up on this fact that he's sitting there, and you could look at the horse, you could see what the problem was. Just like all of his horses, they buy them for Sky Grand Prix, and he rides them, and then they inject them for a couple of years and get by, and then they're gone, and they bring him another one. So and telling people, going and taking lessons from what do you think you're going to learn from somebody like that? He doesn't train his own horses, much less is he going to be able to train yours. So anyway, that's what my whole thing has been, trying to get this information out there before it's lost. I have associate trainer program, which after 10 years of doing it, I have 3 people that I really feel like have been able to really get the system and can apply it and know what to do. And that's Sandra White. She's in Atlanta, has a wonderful barn there, and Marnie Makavorsky, interesting, in New Jersey. And we're actually building an Art to Ride center. So one of her clients is a student of mine. So it's actually just down the road from the Gladstone Center in New Jersey. So they bought 85 acres, and it's going to have a cross-country course and big indoor arena, outdoor arenas, and everything.
So awesome.
So hopefully we'll be doing Art to Ride clinics there. It's probably going to, because there's houses on the property, but no infrastructure, so everything has to be built. So we're probably a year or 2 away from doing anything there. But once that is done, then we will have an Art to Ride center in New Jersey where people can come to lessons. Yeah.
Very cool. So if some of my students are watching this and they're interested in maybe becoming like an associate trainer, what steps would they take?
Excellent. Call me up and say that's what you want to do. And I'm a person who, anybody that tells me, like, over the last 10 or 15 years that I did the associate trainer program, I probably had 25 different people in the thing. Most of them, they all learned things, they got good things, but out of that, I had 3 that I feel like can really do this. So I think that's a pretty good number, in the sense of, but now that I can work with people more regularly like this. So now with the people in the associate trainer program, they have to be working with me online, because I want to be sure that in the future that the people in the associate trainer program are getting more access to me than they had in the process. When I would just see them once a year. Once a year was not enough.
Yeah.
So happily with all of this, once again, thanks to COVID, we got people used to this and doing it, and now we have the infrastructure to be able to do it in most places. So I'm really excited about the possibility. I would like to see a whole nother dressage organization start. I actually have did the whole infrastructure to start something called the World Dressage Federation. And we actually built the websites. I created tests up through 4th level that were much more appropriate for developing horses and this sort of thing. So we're hoping that will become a presence in the I'm still hoping to see that, because I don't think our current dressage, I think what's going to happen to it, I think it will ultimately be kicked out of the Olympic Games, because it's a joke. It's not. It's no longer any kind of amateur sport. It's just billionaires' kids. That's all you're doing, and it's no longer anything that. I mean, when I grew up, you had hopes if you could do it, you could get on the Olympic team, and they might give you some millionaire's horse to ride, because that's how it used to work. That's not going to happen anymore, and I don't think it will change because the money is too powerful that's invested in it now. So I do not think our current situation will ever change. It will just go on. Dressage is simply going to be where all the millionaire and billionaires kids go who are afraid to jump. That's what. In fact, that's one of my favorite Nuno quotes, because he always said that if you're afraid to jump, you'll never be a good dressage rider, because you'll always be afraid of horses that are truly impulsed. He thought everyone should learn to jump, basic jumping before you ever thought about becoming an upper level dressage rider. And because you need to do all those things, you need to have no fear. You need to be comfortable on the back of a horse doing all kinds of different things before you have the idea.
I agree. That's how I grew. I grew up in Massachusetts, so I grew up doing jumping and dressage, and then eventually went to Western disciplines. But I still am very grateful for my background, because I feel like when I moved out to Arizona and I was doing Western stuff, I just felt like I rode much better than the other people because of my training as a child.
And you did exactly right. Same thing. I mean, you got the training that was the real thing instead of this nonsense that people are now learning. So all we can hope to do now is simply be another voice out there that the people, for those few people who to put it this way, but I will anyway. Nuno, another one of my favorite quotes of his, he would always say, this is for the elite. And then he would clarify this, that I'm not talking about money. I'm talking about intelligence, and it's, we used to think of dressage as an art, and we used to, in very lofty terms, and we should still. I mean, the idea, and we saw what happened, for instance, with this woman, Charlotte Desjardins, who at 26 years old is suddenly propped up as the greatest rider in the world. She never was. And it was interesting because I gave a clinic in England shortly thereafter that she won that first thing. And I was saying some of these things. Well, I'm interested to see what's going to happen with this girl. This is one horse that out of nowhere she's riding. Well, she ruined that horse. And ever since then, she's been ruining every horse that she's been getting on, and then we find that videos of her beating the hell out of these horses. And now she's been kicked out of the organization. There are no 26-year-old riders, folks, that are Grand Prix masters. Doesn't exist. Nobody 26 years old has, at least to my knowledge, that I've ever seen, including myself or anybody else, that I ever thought was that good, that could claim that level of mastery at such a young age. And of course, now we see what's happened with the girl. I mean, she's finished, However, she may be finished, but the last year before she got kicked out, she made $2.5 million training horses the year before last. So, that's what it's all about, folks. I mean, and I'm sure that a great deal of that was commissions that she got paid for the horses that she was along with it. They're selling to all these people. So, as I tell to anybody, if you're buying a horse for $1 million, you're a fool. Only a fool would pay $1 million for a horse, no matter how many billions of dollars you have. Because if you're paying $1 million for it, I guarantee you, it's probably been ridden so much that it's probably like you saw that horse Totalis. That horse was completely lame, and everybody knew it when the people bought it for $30 million. I mean, was that the insane thing you ever saw anybody do? They tried to show it 3 times. I mean, that had to have been the most expensive horse show trip anybody ever made. But as I said, no horse should cost that much money, if that makes any sense. I mean, any reasonably sound horse with reasonable gaits could be, as we used to think, could be a Grand Prix winner. And we saw many. And back when the training was based on more correct training, we saw many, many good horses. But how quickly, for instance, Graf George, do you remember Graf George? Graf George was the best horse that was ever produced in America. And it was the first horse to sell for $1 million. It's the horse that sold for $1 million, and it was bought by George Lindemann Jr., who ended up going to jail for having his horses electrocuted. Do you remember that guy? So he wanted to be the first person to be on both the dressage team and the jumping team. So he was buying up every Grand Prix horse he could find, and he paid $1 million for Graf George. Got to show him a few times, and then he went to jail, so, and the ruling, he could never own another horse for the rest of his life either. He went to jail only went to jail for a couple of years, but he could never own a horse for the rest of his life,
Wow.
which is good. Someone like that. I mean, here's a billionaire who's having his horses electrocuted so that he can collect the $150,000 insurance. I mean, what kind of mentality
that's crazy.
would you say to people, that you, so as I say, anybody who would pay $1 million, I'm looking right in those people's eyes, you're all fools, you're throwing away your money. A good trainer, the best young horses in the world, say the best 3-year-old unbroke that you could buy in the world, you could probably buy up for 150,000 or something if it's unbroke, right? Mm-hmm. So when I tell the people, if you got $1 million to spend, buy 5 of those and give them to me, and I'll give you 5 Grand Prix horses, and I'll keep 100,000 for myself. But you know what I'm saying is, a real trainer would not need you to spend $5 million on the horse for them. Mm-hmm. They would be able to take a nice horse and train it so that they can show it.
A sound horse with good conformation and just train it. Yeah.
That's what it used to be. I mean, I think we should have a thing in it'll never happen because the money, but with the Olympic Games, I don't think anybody should be able to ride at the Olympic Games on a horse that they have not owned for at least 4 years or some kind of period. I mean, this idea that these people, like with Totalists, they bought that horse 6 months before the Olympics thinking that he was going to get Olympic gold. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is just insane thinking, and of course it leads to these kind of absurd prices of horses and these kind of things. And imagine what you could have done for the riding world with $30 million. How many underprivileged kids could have gotten to ride a horse, to spend $30 million? They would still be able, I mean, what you could have done with that much money. So anyway.
Yeah, crazy stuff. It is definitely really interesting, though. Thanks for sharing all this, because you definitely brought up a lot of stuff that I wasn't aware of. So it's pretty cool hearing the background and about different things. But yeah, I think my students and whoever else is watching this, I think they'll definitely enjoy this. It's been an interesting segment. So anything else that you want to give anybody as a takeaway message?
Well, just remember, for all the students that are your students with body workers, if people don't know how to do what I'm showing them how to do, what you do is just a waste of time. You're just putting Band-Aids on cuts that will never heal. This ought to be integrated into, this is what body workers should be showing people. This is how horses actually, for instance, most people have no idea that the withers actually moves freely within the shoulder. They don't realize that the withers can totally change, and that you can take a horse that's totally mutton withered, and after a year of correct work over its back, the withers will come up through the shoulders, and the horse will be 2 inches higher than it was when you bought it. Most people today are never taught that. They're told to lock. I mean, once you start locking horse into the frame, nothing ever changes. Once you pull the head in, good training starts at the other end. It doesn't start at the front end. It starts at the back end. And the last thing to ever become stable is the head and neck. That's the last thing that stabilizes. When the rest of the horse has developed, then that can stabilize, and now you have a trained horse that you can ride for 25 years.
Exactly.
Your body work is just coming as a help.
Yep. I have a mare that I bought as a 4-year-old, and she's turning 24 or 25 this year, and she's still our best riding horse on the property. Everybody fights over who gets to ride her, and people look at her, they have no idea how old she is.
That's excellent.
Because I've had her since she was 4, and I started her the right way, and she's had a good life. So
you didn't kill her in the process. That's fantastic. Yeah. Well, it's been wonderful meeting you today. I hope this helps somewhere along the way, and that's what we all have to do, is get out there and just keep talking about the right things and keep talking about the welfare of the animals and all this, because that is what's important. These animals are our friends, folks. They're our friends and our family, and you've got to ask yourself, what you're doing to that horse, would you do to your sister? Would you do to your brother? Would you do to your mother? Or your cousin, or even a friend?
Yeah, exactly. That's why I think it's so important to just bring up these subjects and make people more aware. I think sometimes people just don't think about it. They don't put 2 and 2 together. So thank you so much. This has been really insightful, and it's been great learning more about you.
Excellent, as well for you. So good luck with what you're doing, and I hope we all just keep making some progress on making the lives of these animals better in the future.
Me too.
Thank you. You have a wonderful day.
You too.
All right, bye.